Now we have the pleasure in welcoming Nick Greene. He is the author of How to Watch Basketball Like a Genius, which comes out this week, March 2nd, 2021, via Abrams Press. Welcome, Nick. Thanks for joining the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Nick, just for a little bit of background on us, Matt and I were, childhood friends since middle school, huge basketball fans. So, when reading this book, I can probably speak for Matt. Our brains probably has exploded with tons of questions. They're going in 1,000 different directions. So, let's not waste any time. And
Cool.
I just want to start with a basic question, Nick. What was your first experience with just the game of basketball yourself, in terms of just watching it on TV or just playing it on the playground?
Gosh, I'm sure it was watching it on TV. I grew up in Chicago, and I really sort of grew up in the 90s, so it was impossible to avoid the Chicago Bulls, obviously. And I'm sure it was watching the sport rather than playing it, although I used to love to play it. I was never very good at it, but I was always great at sitting on the couch and watching basketball. So I'm sure it was early. I mean, I remember the 91 finals, Lakers Bulls, and I'm sure there's a bunch of stuff before that as well. But that was definitely formative, as it was for a lot of people.
And Nick, I was just reading through this book. Matt and I were chatting off air. It's really dense. It's not super long, but it has so much information jam packed into it. Can you just discuss how you created the idea of coming up with a book like this? Because just going through just different basketball books, this book is very unique in just in the way the approach to the game. So can you just kind of go over just your framework and just how you created it, the concept?
Yeah, for sure. So the main concept of the book is I talk to experts in seemingly unrelated fields about the game of basketball, their impressions of it, what they see when they watch, and the idea for that really came from just basically noticing that I was having so many conversations with random people in my life about basketball, people who weren't basketball writers or even huge or self-professed hardcore fans, people who just enjoy the game. And it got me thinking, like, wow, there's so much I can learn about a sport that I watch all the time, that I write about. And I thought it'd be a kind of a fun way to just explore the history and the growth and the evolution. And I'm like a big rabbit hole kind of guy, I stay up late going through Wikipedia pages, and the research in this book is beyond Wikipedia. Don't worry, I want to make that clear. But
it definitely is. It definitely is.
Yeah, I love just pulling threads on things, and basketball is such a fun sport with not just a rich history, but the fact that it can be traced to a single inventor. It's young. It's only a 100 so years old. That it kind of was possible to get this bird's eye view of the sport that was a kind of a fun little quest for me to just learn as much as I could in the weirdest possible ways, I guess.
Awesome. Yeah. And Nick, one of the things I want to pick your brain about, so much of this book, of course, as you just mentioned, is about the evolution of the game. When you look at modern basketball right now, I mean, it always seems like when we're in the moment, like when we were in the 90s, we had big men were the centerpiece of teams. I had an interview with another author about a lot about Patrick Ewing and as the center of the Knicks. And it just seemed like that was going to stick around forever. And then, of course, I mean, in large, I think due to Michael Jordan, kind of broke the mold. And we see the sport changing. I was doing a deep dive the other night, and I saw a prospect who's 6'9", and my thought was that's amazing. He's pretty mobile and things, but I'm also wondering, like, can he even stay on the court? I mean, we have players like Boban, very skilled and very big, but a lot of teams, for good perimeter scoring, you just can't keep him on the floor necessarily. So I'm wondering, do you think that we might see in the future like a pendulum swing back to bigs? Or with all this research that you've done, where do you kind of see the game going, if you can look into your crystal ball for me?
Yeah, no, it's something I've thought a lot about. with the 3-point line, obviously, is just such a incredible incentive for players, and it's something that I speak in the book with Kirk Goldsberry, who's a very well-known basketball mind, but he's actually trained as a cartographer. He's a map maker.
Oh, wow.
And so his approach to the 3-point line is, and he noticed it basically by making maps of the court and seeing where people were shooting. And he noticed that, gosh, people really aren't shooting that much behind the 3-point line. This was earlier in the century, obviously. They're taking long twos. If you take a step back a foot, you get this incredible, huge incentive. And so that was we all saw it. We saw it with the Warriors in the last decade. We saw it with a little bit with the Suns, 8 seconds or less Suns, which sort of really upped the ante when it came to 3-pointers. And it's hard to imagine that ever going away, just because players are, so good at threes, and they're growing up shooting threes, obviously, because they know that there's that incentive. Whereas Michael Jordan never had to sort of practice a 3-pointer growing up. And so, in order to get bigs back in the pendulum swing, you'd have to figure out a way to lessen the incentives for 3-pointers. I think. You have it now. You have big guys who can shoot threes. That's an amazing thing, but you also have to defend threes. And you mentioned Boban, and I just think about Roy Hibbert, how effective and great he was not that long ago. He's in his early 30s still, and he's out of the league because it's hard to imagine, but I wouldn't bet against it, because if the history of basketball has taught us anything, it's that it's always changing and things may swing back. And you know what? Like you mentioned Michael Jordan, another dominant big man could, with a really special skill set, and who could kind of conjure up magic inside, that might swing it the other way. But gosh, it's hard to predict, and I don't think anyone could predict the game would look like it does today, 20 years ago even. So it's pretty wild.
Yeah, in your discussions with all the different experts that you interviewed, one common topic that's been thrown around, and something that we see that kind of trends on Twitter every now and then, is like making the logo shot. So just within half court range, going kind of on the other end rather than the pendulum swinging back, maybe progression forward. Did anyone you speak to mention like the possibility of a 4-point shot or things along those lines? What are your thoughts on that?
I spoke with Kirk Goldsberry about that too, and he hates that idea just because he and he's not alone. I agree with him somewhat, is that the art of the mid-range game is disappearing, and loves seeing post-up plays. And he said, using his maps, he found like the hardest place on the floor where the lowest percentage of shots are made, or that little elbow, with your back to the basket, having to go over a defender. And if there's ever a way of incentivizing that shot, making that worth 4 points, at least in his estimation, his recommendation, that's where you should put the 4-point line, inside where you can do that. But who knows? I love watching Dame Lillard shoot from a million miles away. It's the coolest thing. And it's almost, in my mind, even cooler and more badass that it's not worth 4 points. It's like, I'm just taking the shot. It's worth 3 points. Because I know I can make it. I'm that confident. And that's pretty cool.
Agreed.
Nick, to your point about shooting, I kind of want to shift to dribbling, because your book goes into detail with that. And I noticed that with the history of the game, it was very rigid, very not willing to really experiment with just different, variations of the game earlier on. And I wanted to ask you just the way basketball is in terms of, I believe it's a lot more of a fluid, creative, a game based on improvisation compared to other team sports. Do you think the James Naismith, other basketball purists, how do you think they would feel just watching, athletes participating like at Rucker Park or And One, or just even like the Harlem Globetrotters, those that purposely just mess with the structure of the game and turn it upside down? Do you think they'd be highly offended by that, or do you think they're finding more, hey, they're taking the game and evolving it?
Yeah, I think. Well, it depends who it is. Naismith, in particular, I think would really think it was pretty cool. Because in his rules, you weren't allowed to move with a basketball, which is crazy. That's not basketball. We don't know it as basketball. But some players at Yale, the story goes, invented dribbling by passing to themselves, and Naismith actually liked that. And he liked anything that made the game more enjoyable for the players and for the fans. He didn't care about. He didn't make any money from basketball. He rejected any sort of chances to copyright it. His whole sort of thing was, this is for fun. And this is for people to learn how to kind of, while playing within the rules, but also sort of experimenting when that's appropriate. And so I think, especially something like Rucker Park, where it's just people showing up and playing and working out and having fun, I think he would love that. What he would hate the most, I think, is March Madness and anything that's extremely corporatized. He even wrote an essay, I think I mentioned in the book, in the early 20th century, bemoaning the sort of the money-driven aspect of college sports, even back then. So that he wouldn't like. But I think anything with sort of people having fun with his game, he was down for. And then you have early college coaches who are extremely rigid, like you mentioned, Justin, and those people, I think, well, their minds would explode if they just saw 5 seconds of an and one mixtape. So it's a good thing they didn't, I think, see that.
To your point, Nick, you brought up this about college sports, and now we're seeing, just fairly recently with some legislation that athletes within college are able to have more possession over their likeness and make money while playing for these colleges. How would you think, I guess, Naismith and just others, based on just your guess, and that's your own opinion too, would feel about this? Because now we're at a point where a lot of these college students can, monetize even in high school from YouTube, social media. They are huge stars. Matt and I were talking about Paige Buckers, who's now a huge star at UConn. And just, I heard about her on Instagram as a high schooler. And we all know about Zion and just other ones. Do you think, I just want your opinion on how we're knowing about these players from such a younger age, and maybe just the pressures that they have when they're not in that college or professional spotlight?
I think he'd be pretty confounded. He obviously would hated the universities and corporate elements and entities making money off of college players. But I think anyone making money off of his game, he always thought was, I think, a little weird. He just kept, he thought it's just a game. That's what he thought it was. It's just a game. He didn't even care about winning or losing, which explains his terrible record as a coach in Kansas. So I think the sort of, him, the entire, from start to finish, the idea of basketball as a corporatized and money-making endeavor would have just blown him away, and not necessarily in a good way.
Can you talk about?
But it's not he's gone, so it's not up to him now.
Sure.
Right, Nick. Can you talk a little bit about? And I don't want to give away anything in the book. You definitely check that out, you guys. But can you talk about how basketball was kind of able to spread like a wildfire in the 1900s? I mean, it came from such an obscure location, and then I think because of structure, and like you talk about the 13 rules that Naismith invented, and we talked about earlier about dribbling and how you're able to kind of tweak these rules a little bit or manipulate them, however you want to put it. Can you just talk about the mass appeal of basketball and how that was able to grow?
For sure. I mean, this was such a right place, right time kind of thing. It was invented for kids or not kids, these were, young adults at the YMCA in Springfield, Massachusetts to play. And the fact that it was at the YMCA, which even in the late 1800s had this huge footprint around the world. There were YMCAs all, on continent, spread around the globe. And so the fact that they could take Naismith's rules and put it in the YMCA paper, and then, weeks later, boom, people all over the country have the same idea of the game as those in Springfield. And it was, the kind of thing that 10, 20 years prior couldn't have happened. I must say that they didn't specify which ball you're supposed to use, or I believe what height the hoops were at in those original rules when they published it in the newspaper. So there was a few weeks where really weird versions of basketball were being played that were lost when those corrections went out in the YMCA newspaper. But yeah, he got lucky. It makes you think how many amazing games someone's inventing in their driveway or invented, with friends that just didn't pick up because they didn't have that sort of. I talked to a game designer for this section about his original rules, and he called that an embedded base. If you're making a game for the computer, everyone's got a computer now, so you can put it up there and people will play it. Back then, the YMCA was this embedded base where everyone could sort of learn the game and play it at their local YMCA too.
Hmm.
Nick, I just want to ask you about the YMCA. You brought that up just because, in middle school, I was a member of the YMCA, but it's kind of one of those things I have, especially as a youngster, no reference as to how important the YMCA really was. So can you kind of go over as an organization, how important was the YMCA just in general and also to the game of basketball? Because you mentioned in the book that if it wasn't for the YMCA, the sport maybe would have remained regional. Can you kind of go in more detail about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, for example, there were YMCA's in China in the late 1800s. I mean, it became a global game because of the YMCA, and the fact that it was an organization that was not just dedicated to religion or just to education, as in reading books and things. It cherished and sort of prioritized physical fitness and physical education, which is what Naismith was tasked with doing. He was a PE teacher. And right now it's, it seems kind of obvious, but back then there weren't that many, I guess, venues for young people to sort of play games and sports and I guess run around. And in the case of the Springfield YMCA, let off some steam because it's, freezing outside, and the only other diversion these people had was to beat each other up. So Naismith had to invent a game. But yeah, the YMCA was a organization, I guess, much like it is today, where it seems simple, just a place for people to, learn and play. And back then it just happened to sort of really make basketball what it is. It's amazing to think about. And again, how lucky, he could have been a teacher at just a normal high school or college in New England, and no one would ever know the game of basketball.
Nick, did you happen to look into kind of like, because I would say, obviously American football is huge in America, but soccer or football to the rest of the world is, I would say, what I've seen anyway, still the most popular sport globally. There is any chance that basketball in the future down the road can kind of take that number one spot? I would say on a global scale, it seems like basketball is number 2 right now, unless I'm missing a big sport. But is basketball in a position to continue growing from what you've seen and what you've researched?
Most definitely. I mean, because when you look at the biggest sports in the world, as you mentioned, it's soccer and it's cricket and basketball. Obviously, cricket has in India and parts of Asia, and it's huge there. But the advantage that basketball, I think, has over something like cricket is it's pretty simple. Whereas cricket, anyone who's tried to watch cricket can tell you, I've tried. I don't, there's the game, the matches last multiple days sometimes. I don't know where everyone's standing, but not to besmirch cricket too much. I don't know how many of your listeners are devout cricket enthusiasts. But the simplicity of basketball, like soccer, makes it extremely likely to, just catch on. And whether, overtaking soccer it's hard to imagine that happening. But then again, it's hard to imagine basketball becoming as popular as it has. You see how many great players from all around the world are in the NBA, and it's just going to keep going like that. I mean, there's, yeah. If it became the biggest sport in the world, I think that'd be pretty cool, and it definitely has what it needs to, I think, to really do that.
Nick, the book also goes into the 1980s in terms of the NBA transitioning into Michael Jordan taking over the league, and
Yeah.
you also mentioned in terms from a presentation standpoint slow motion replays, and I thought that was really interesting because I guess when I was really younger, I do remember Wide World of Sports on ABC being a huge deal. And I didn't have cable at the time, but just seeing the intro and just the slow motion shots of that being really iconic before now we have 4K and all these camera angles and all this technology. It's pretty insane. But can you just put into context as to how important slow motion was in terms of telling more of that visual story of not only just basketball, but other sports as well?
Yeah, this is something that I learned in researching the book. Really, it was, we take slow motion for granted. I always just thought as long as there's been televised sports, there's been players jumping and weaving through. Slow-mo's been there, but that's not true. I mean, it was invented in the 60s, but it was a really clunky, slow technology. It's not slow in the way intended, but you'd have a separate machine for slow-mo. You'd have to process it through these refrigerator-sized tape decks, and you'd be lucky to have a slow-mo clip by the end of the game. But in the middle of the 80s, the technology evolved, and it became something you could do instantaneous slow motion. And it went from being choppy and blurry and only one angle to multiple angles. And coincidentally, this is when the sort of most athletic, amazing athlete the world has ever seen entered the NBA. And you have Michael Jordan not only, flying through the air in real time, which is obviously impressive in its own right. You have these production crews able to slow it down. And he knew, he there's quotes of him saying, I know that if I kind of flare my legs, I can give it the impression that I'm floating in space. He knew how to sort of play to that illusion of flight. And, I talked to a professor who's done lots of studies on time perception and awe. And, when we have moments of awe, there's this time can slow down for the observer too. And when you actually slow down things themselves, that can manufacture this sensation of awe. And so what you have is basically something that's already amazing being slowed down to make it even more amazing. And it's almost like the what we were just talking about with Naismith and the YMCA being perfect timing. The fact that of all people, Michael Jordan came to the scene when slow motion really became a thing was extremely serendipitous for everyone.
Yeah, good fate for sure. Nick, since we're talking about slow motion replay, which I think is obviously a great thing, one of the only weaknesses, if I were to critique the NBA as a product, which don't get me wrong, I love basketball. I think it's the most beautiful sport there is. I think
I know
the most pleasing to watch. But last 2 minutes of games can take 15 minutes, maybe even longer in some cases. Sometimes drama of that is good in the playoffs, I think. But did you talk about this topic with any of the experts you interviewed? And what are your thoughts on maybe some potential solutions to something that sometimes I think is the biggest problem with the sport?
Oh yeah, no, I don't think you're alone. In fact, I think I'm very weird in that I never really minded it, mostly because my kind of attention flutters everywhere, and those breaks, I have time to kind of check my phone and look elsewhere, and it's almost like a little ADHD break for myself. But I understand why it's so annoying. And gosh, I think, well, they have the replay center in Secaucus, which is a great idea, except it doesn't seem to be speeding things up. It'd be nice if things like out of bounds, which you'd assume could be made from that remote headquarters, referee wearing an earpiece. It's annoying that they have to go over to the monitor at the side of the court and still look at the replays when they're already being looked at in New Jersey. It would be nice if they could cut that out and just have, an earpiece and the person sitting there says, oh, that was inbounds or that was out of bounds. That would be an obvious choice. But then you have things more subjective with the replay, fouling and things like that. And that's always going to be tough. But I do think that, I think one thing that would help a lot is if they just muted Jeff Van Gundy complaining about the replays during the games. I think that would, it would still be annoying and long, but it wouldn't be quite as tedious.
Yes. Sometimes I enjoy his complaining for some reason. It's just like an acquired taste.
I like Van Gundy,
I don't know.
That's
I get it, though, for sure.
It's after you've heard one rant about his one of his rants about replay. I think you've heard them all
for sure.
Nick, to that point with Van Gundy, and I noticed him and I think a little bit Mark Jackson, but more you see with it like inside the NBA with Shaq and Charles Barkley, that more get off your lawn mentality in terms of like the older generation and the newer generation. I guess since basketball is evolving so quickly, and you mentioned along with Matt, Damian Lillard taking shots from the logo, Trae Young, Steph Curry's doing this. Do you see the game going to a point where it's so, I guess it's veered off to just a space that's not resembling what the core fundamentals of the game originally was? Is that perhaps a danger at that point that you see, or should just the game just be allowed to just evolve naturally? And just a second question to that, do you see any parts of basketball that you think is bulletproof, that will remain steady no matter what changes happen throughout time, I guess?
So that's interesting. So to your first question, I do think it's old timers complaining about the new generation. I think is something that's always going to happen, whether or not they have a point. And you have part of me enjoys that because it puts into relief how much basketball has changed, and it's a way of acknowledging, wow, this is much different, and I think that's interesting. And then you can have these debates on is this better, is that better, and I think that's all worthwhile. I think when Shaq was really weird to Donovan Mitchell and sort of was really pulling his old timer card, that's weird, but that's also just a kind of thing that you have to have a delicate balance with, because again, I do think it's cool to have the generational differences because it basically makes the game it makes it evident that the game is a changing entity, and that's a good thing. As to just how much is good of that change and how much is bad, the game is able to self-regulate. If it does get out of hand, then the rules change. You saw that in the middle of the century when there was too much stalling. Boom, the shot clock comes in. This is the kind of thing that a lot of people have money invested in, and if it's entertaining to watch, if it makes the game more entertaining to watch, I believe that eventually, may not always be a direct route, but you'll get there. And going back into your second point, what won't change? I would say free throws, because that really is one of the few things that stayed steady. But there are people saying, "Oh, there are too many free throws. It's boring. There should be one free throw. You get one free throw that if you make it, you get 2 points. If you miss it, you get 0 points." I mean, I've heard that sort of suggested change. But still, I think free throws, it breaks up the game. The players need the rest there. It's such a simple, obvious sort of approach to a problem, which would be fouling. I think free throws are here to stay, and they're. I don't think people will get better at them, but I think they're here to stay.
Yeah, I wonder if people wanting to abolish free throws have ever run fives.
Mm,
How
yeah.
exhausting basketball is. That seems like
Yeah.
a solution from someone who maybe is watching the game a lot, hasn't played. I not to be mean to anyone who has that opinion, but
Oh no! As someone who watches the game a lot and doesn't play that much, I will say that watching people running fives, not too bad. It's kind of entertaining, actually.
right.
But yeah, I get it. Yeah, I think it's a breather, and we forget often watching, especially in the NBA, where these are the best athletes in the world. That man, that must be tiring.
Just a final question for you, Nick, and then we'll let you
Sure.
go.
Great.
I want to kind of ask you about basketball with the pandemic, and just in terms of how do you think the game has been affected from that standpoint, just because the normal pipeline of talent from, middle school, high school, college, pros, to just people being able to play in the park, that was stopped in 2020. Do you see that being a major disturbance in the evolution of the game, or do you think that's just going to be a blip on the radar if we do hopefully get out of this and everything goes back to normal?
Yeah, like with so many things with the pandemic, it's so hard to predict the future with it. As far as that's interesting, I haven't thought about that as it being a disruption. I'll see sometimes on Instagram they'll have highlights of the great, the best high school players, and you'll see these kids playing in masks, and I just think, man, this is wild. And I think when they're in the NBA and they're rolling their old high school footage, it's going to be a kind of we'll get PTSD of seeing this, replaying this horrible time over again. But it's so hard to say. I think people still are playing. It might be a blip because evolution, whether it's literal evolution or the evolution of a game, it takes time. I thought, for example, the quality of play in the bubble was fantastic. And there are a lot of theories about that. The one that I think is correct is just the fact that there are only 22 teams, and if you get rid of the 8 worst teams in the NBA, the games are going to be more competitive. It's pretty obvious, but nonetheless, I thought the quality of play was great, and so I think was a weird and I guess I don't want to say pleasant surprise, because everything about these players being in a hermetically sealed inside a Disney bubble is weird and not ideal, but I thought that was a pleasant side effect. Now the current season, I'm enjoying watching it. I think it's a side effect of the very short off season, that it does seem like defense is more optional than ever, and players are taking more plays off, and I don't blame them. I mean, they had almost no time to turn around. But that's the kind of thing that will that have long-term effects? Gosh, I really don't know. I mean, it'd be one thing if the NBA saw the bubble and said, you know what, the quality is so much better, we're going to contract the league. But that's never going to happen in a million years. So I don't think that's going to be a evolutionary change in that regard. But yeah, it's one of those things where I guess you just got to wait and see.
Well, Nick, thank you very much for joining the show. We really enjoyed your book. Please let our listeners and viewers know where we can find the book and any other projects you're working on in the new year, and also where we can find you on social media as well.
Sure. Well, I want to thank you guys for having me on. This was great. I really appreciate it. The book is called How to Watch Basketball Like a Genius. It's sold where you can buy wherever books are sold. And online, I do a lot of writing for Slate, and you can find me at Nick Greene on Twitter, Greene with an E on the end. Otherwise, just enjoy the book. If you like weird things about basketball and other aspects of life, it might be for you. So check it out.
And I would plug, very modest there, Nick, I would plug also, if you want an in-depth history, learn some new things about the history of the league, really, truly a great read. Thank you so much for joining us, Nick.
Agreed.
Thanks again. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate you being on the show, Nick. Thank you very much.